All right. It is 12:01. We're going to give folks about 2 minutes, a little bit of grace, while people are still joining us. So come into the room, and if you're online and you know of a colleague who's supposed to be there, send them a text, let them know that we're going to start in about 1 minute. Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our program entitled The Power of Nursing, Understanding and Applying the New ANA Code of Ethics for Nursing, Part 1. This is a 4-part series that we will do over the next couple of months, so do join us again. All the dates are here in the flyer in which you were sent, in which you are registered. I'm Dr. Sheldon Fields, the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion here in the Ross and Carol Neese College of Nursing at Penn State University, and I will be serving as your moderator for this program series. Of all forms of inequity, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. Quote by Martin Luther King. The Penn State University Acknowledgement of Land. The Pennsylvania State University encompasses campuses are located on the original homelands of the Erie, Haudenosaunee, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora, Lenape, Delaware, Shawnee, Asante, Easton, and Oklahoma, Susquehannock, and Wazazi Osage nations. As a land-grant institution, we acknowledge and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands and our place in that history. Before we proceed, just a quick few business things. So if you want to obtain continuing education hours and you are a nurse, your attendance at this lecture can earn you 1 contact hour through Penn State Ross and Carol Neese College of Nursing. To receive that 1 contact hour, you must attend the full program and complete the evaluation. The Penn State Ross and Carol Neese College of Nursing is approved as a provider of nursing continuum professional development by the Pennsylvania State Nurses Association, an accredited approver by the American Nursing Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The topic of this educational series is non-clinical, and therefore we did not identify, mitigate, or disclose relevant financial relationships. Our very special guest for this Part 1 series is Dr. Lori Badzik, Professor and Dean of our College of Nursing. Dean Badzik is a nurse ethicist and has served on past ANA committees that revised the Nursing Code of Ethics in the past. It is this unique history with the Code of Ethics that she has that we will be discussing today as we kick off this program series. Without further ado, let's start today's conversation with our very special guest, Dean Badzik. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the 2025 Nursing Code of Ethics. Your longstanding leadership in nursing ethics makes your perspective quite unique. Welcome.
Thank you, Sheldon. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a moment of reflection on the events from Minnesota and the loss of a nurse, Alex Pritt. Alex was a Big Ten alum, so we feel some allegiance to them. I did attend the University of Minnesota event yesterday that was an online event for their alumni and community. in support of Dean Connie Delaney, who spoke at that event. I want to share my support and sympathy for Alex's family, for his friends, for his colleagues. I think all of us are reflecting today that no matter what the circumstances, the loss of a nurse is the loss of a nurse. And someone yesterday or today is stepping in to fill the shift. So I encourage you to read the statements that are already out there and, to reflect on this moment in time. I ask maybe for a moment of silence since it is an ethics event, and perhaps we just take a minute to reflect on the loss of a nurse.
Thank you, Dean Badzik. Okay, let's start today by you briefly talking about the historical importance of the Nursing Code of Ethics to the nursing profession and how you got involved in helping to update previous versions of the code.
Yeah, I think the involvement should come first. So I'm going to flip your question and talk about how I became involved, because my involvement stems actually from my time as a nurse, working as a nurse with patients in clinical settings. I became very interested in the ethical issues that were in my own surrounding. Became engaged with the ethics committee, which was kind of novel at that time, and that's another event in history we can talk about, the advent of ethics committees, but became involved in attending that programming, became very interested, and ultimately served on the committee for a major hospital system, and then became an ethics consultant for that system and spent 5 years going into the different hospitals, the Children's Hospital, the psych hospital, the regular hospital, into the intensive care units, into the clinics, helping to resolve those ethical issues. As a result of that and my adventure into law school, which all sort of culminated after that, I was invited to come to ANA and to be the director of their Center for Ethics and Human Rights. When I first entered the job as the ethics director at ANA, they were my very first meeting in my first couple of weeks there was the ANA House of Delegates in 1998. And at that House of Delegates, what I thought was going to be a new code of ethics adopted was a rejection of the code of ethics at that time as it had been written by the ANA House of Delegates, which threw me fully into how do we fix what the House rejected and why was it rejected? Because I was new to the position. And I think what we came to learn was that the Code of Ethics isn't just the provisions. At the time, only the provisions were presented to the ANA House of Delegates to be accepted. And what we learned was it's really the context of those provisions. It's the statements that are listed under that. That is what people really care about. And so we had to go back and really formulate carefully the entire code, all of the provisions and the statements and the explanations, and develop a really different type of code to be presented to the House of Delegates, which had never been done before. That effort took several years. And it was in 2001 that we had that code of ethics that came out. I was still at ANA in 2013 when we decided life had changed. Things keep changing. So society changes, the context of healthcare changes, medicine changes, nursing changes. And so the code has to change because the code's a living document. It's not a static document. And so, we began the process again. And so then I did the 2001, 2015. Here we are 10 years later, 2025. And when I was at ANA, because both of those processes were so intense, we asked the board of directors to continue to review the code on a shorter time frame every 10 years, because 15 just seemed way too long, from 85 to 2000, from 2000 to 2015. And that process actually starts several years in advance. So it starts like in year 7, pulling people together just to make a recommendation if we need to update or change the code. And so I have to profess that I am not a 2025 member of the committee, though I am the mentor. My mentee is now the Center for Ethics and Human Rights Director. And so I give credit to her for carrying forward the banner, and also for the good work that she led. So I led the prior to, not this one. I did have some integration, but it's really interesting, Sheldon. I really wasn't involved at all in the discussions around provision 1 or 2.
Right.
So there was much more discussion around bigger changes in other provisions. And so I do not profess to be an expert in this. I spent a lot of time really thinking and looking at the changes throughout the code. And so I think it's, that's kind of how I got there. Historically, the importance, the reverse part of the question is, well, it's been 150 years since we really started thinking about a code of ethics. And it all stems from Florence Nightingale. So she's sort of our modern nursing person. Many of the principles that she carried out in her works and her words have been adopted into our code. It is the reason, one of the reasons, and not the only reason, but a really key reason why ANA was formed. In order to have a true profession, you have to have a code of ethics. It's what grounds us. It's the ethical practice that we follow, and it's the standard for us. And for nursing, the code of ethics for nurses is a non-negotiable standard. That is our commitment to society. It is what we say we will do, and is what we must do. So the first formal adoption of a code, even though this goes back 150 years, historically was really only 75 years ago. There were some writings, and you can find those published in the old AJN series, American Journal of Nursing, about earlier versions. One was even called a suggested code, but they really weren't professional codes. So the first one that was voted on did not come until 1950. There have been 8 versions roughly since then, maybe 9. I'd have to go back and explicate each one, that have either revised or changed in some way the code. So our modern code is really only 75 years old. So there are a lot of people in nursing who've been around since the very first one was developed. Mm-hmm. So the last thing I would say is that I do have copies of all of these things. If someone's really interested in obtaining one of them, it was, life's work as I began to get all of these together. But the early versions of the code are very tiny. One is a single page. And then there are others that move on to very small booklets. But the ones that I've been involved in really changed the world. And so I brought them with me. So this is the 2001 code, and this particular code has 25 pages. This code did add a preface, an index, and the evolution of the code into the book along with an afterword. So 25 pages. In 2015, we couldn't fit it into 25 pages. So it expanded, and we put it in 40 pages. We added an introduction after the preface, and we added a full glossary. So extension, all those other things that were put into this one were in this one, and then we added more. And then we come to the newest one, 47 pages. So again, a significant increase, same format, but added a 10th provision. You'll note I did have one like this that was tabbed like this, but it was totally destroyed and not really a good thing to bring and demonstrate to the world. But it's important. It's a working document. It's not something I have memorized, nor should anyone memorize it. It is a working document. It is a place to go. But obviously it has to be read so that you have an understanding of what's in there. So I think that takes us to wherever you want to go next.
Well, thank you for the historical background and for letting us understand how you combined your training as a nurse and scholar that you brought to this work. So it's been 10 years, as you pointed out, since the code was last updated. So please give us an overview of the major changes or the differences between the 2015 version of the code and the new 2025 version.
So I think there are four significant areas. And the first area is right up front in section 1, provision 1, cannot be missed. And that is the addition and recognition of structural oppression, racism, intersectionality, and social justice as core ethical concerns. And I think I have to read this section. I'm sorry to read to everyone, but when you open the first page, this is something you really need to think about. So I highlighted two little parts of this, and you can see I've already started working on what I'm thinking about the new code. But I think the one statement that's absolutely new, words has never been used before, is that nurses condemn dehumanization in all its forms. And then just a little further down the second paragraph, this is on the first page. It says nurses aim to mitigate all forms of bias and prejudice and their actual and potential effects. Nurses ought to recognize racism and other forms of bigotry, prejudicial bias, and discrimination, and then there's some descriptors of that, as harmful assaults that negatively impact and violate the human dignity of the individual. It is essential to address health disparities by providing culturally concordant care, fostering patient-centered communication, and engaging in allyship to improve patient outcomes. It really is all about the outcome. And if we don't recognize these things as we ought, then healthcare will not be as good as we can make it. The second area, and I won't read anymore, I promise, although unless you ask something that I just feel compelled to pull something out, is about the furtherance of well-being for the nurse. Obviously, in our college, this is something that's really important to me, and this was added more clearly during my time working in the code. But now it's really out there, and it's even been extended now to human flourishing, which is a new concept, again, that is expressed in the code. I think that the next thing is provision 7. And maybe it'd take a minute, Sheldon, to back up and talk a little bit about how the code is organized.
Yes.
So I know you had that on one of your slides just before this, that the first sections and what we're going to focus on primarily today are really about nurse to patient and who that patient might be and what are our commitments and, where is our compassionate care come from and how are we looking at this, as nurses working in a humanitarian way with our patients. But when you get to provision 7, it's about nurse to the profession. And I think that this is where many of the new concepts are coming out around ethics and technology and advances in genomics and artificial intelligence. And all of these different things are beginning to really be clearly demonstrated as part of our time in terms of the Code of Ethics. And finally, provision 10, of course, is all new. I think prior versions that we wrote when we first started really developing the nurses, nurse to profession relationship and the nurse to society relationship really kind of was pushing us in this direction. But certainly, the internet and the world after 2020, the change that occurred as everything moved online with COVID is really being reflected here because our relationships truly are now global. I mean, we purchase things globally, we discuss with people globally. I myself will be headed to Hong Kong soon. Our college has a relationship with the Chinese University of Hong Kong as well as others. So I think we have global relationships and we all recognize that there are many things we're kind of in it together.
Yes. So thank you for the summary. In provision 10, to your point, there are now 10 provisions in the 2025 updated code, whereas there were only 9 in the last provision. And the global health, global community provision really does hone in specifically on that and talks about even how nurses and nursing organizations also have ethical responsibilities toward human and environmental health worldwide, including health diplomacy, global solidarity, and sustainable health practices, is what the code actually talks about. So now that we have the history of the background, we're going to focus for our rest of our time on discussing provision 1 and provision 2. So I would now like to make sure that we have provision 1 up for everybody to see. And I'm going to read the provision. Provision 1, the nurse practices with compassion and respect for the inherent dignity, worth, and unique attributes of every person. So provision 1, Dean Bazick, emphasizes compassion, respect, and human dignity. In your view, why is this provision considered the ethical foundation upon which the rest of the code is built?
You know, it establishes our moral commitment. It brings right up front the moral baseline that we're working from and really sets the standard of caring, which is where nursing begins. You know, it brings us to our commitments of human dignity, compassion, and respect for the unique aspects of each person who comes within our care. So it gives us a universal ethical lens to look at everything through. And, you know, it's the basis that we view all other provisions through. So it starts with 1. And when we center on the inherent worth of each person, we focus on that justice, advocacy, collaboration, safety, and respect that follows in other provisions. You know, it begins right here. And it guides our moral identity. And I did bring a prop.
Okay.
So I just have to share it. So you all know I love a compass.
Yes.
And why is it I love a compass? Because I think it sets our direction. And I want to say, always find your true north. Your true north starts in provision 1. I also needed this pillow because it's a really deep chair. But I did bring that prop.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, to your point, you know, and more specifically, how does the 2025 updated code reflect the evolving understanding of dignity and respect, especially in increasingly diverse, multicultural, and digitized healthcare environments?
Well, I think much has led us here. So, you know, historically, you know, even at ANA, we've had recognition of our own failures as an organization. And, you know, I think it's recognition that we need to reflect on the community that we serve. It brings us to expand dignity to things like cultural humility, intersectionality, respect for diverse entities and diverse people. You know, it even talks about digital dignity. You know, how are our interactions in a new world now? Everything is not in person. And, you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding that comes and importance of communication when you start talking about virtual encounters. You know, from our own college, most of our students are really aware of inclusive person-centered care. We spend a lot of time at this college talking about that, especially in relation to the CGNE and elder persons, but it applies to everyone. Right. We have to do person-centered care. And I think that it leads us to equitable treatment of all. So I think those are kind of key to your question.
Okay, all right. So per the new guidance that's in the updated 2025 code, then what will you say that nurses can do to assess and overcome personal bias when delivering patient care?
Yeah, and this is something, again, we've been working on this for a while now. We have, many of us have taken, CEs and trainings to really understand bias, both implicit bias as well as other bias. Bias goes beyond just what we think. But I think that we have to continually seek to understand bias. We all have bias. For anyone to think they don't have bias, that they're not biased, that's not correct. And all you have to do is take one training and you will figure out how quickly, we view the world sort of through our own lens. And so we have to open ourselves to bias screening tools. And I learned about a really incredible tool that someone was developing that I hope someday comes here, that you can, it's sort of an AI-based thing that when students are clinically, even in simulation, talking and working with the patient, it identifies their biases. Now, isn't that amazing? Biases they don't even know that they have. So I think it calls for us to use some standardized and evidence-based tools that everyone can use, and to continue to advocate for equitable systems. I have to add that silence is not acceptable ever. And that we really, as nurses, from day one, whether you're in practice 1 day, 100 days, or 20 years or more, we all need to have a voice and advocate for those equitable systems. And we have to challenge any policies that we see that might, perpetuate disparities. And I will add one other thing about, this, talk about bias. We have to remember it's now explicitly stated in our code that that health is a universal right. So everyone deserves help.
Right. There were some other things, particularly about this one. Not only does it now explicitly talks about the universality of health, but one of the major differences when talking about bias is the upfront words that are very intentional around institutional racism, and actually codifies within the practice of nursing that racism is an ethical violation. And that is also speaks to this provision that we really must treat people all the same. We don't get to choose our patients as nurses. We never should. So that then takes us to what this particular provision talks about in terms of patient autonomy and informed consent. So provision 1 also reinforces honoring patient autonomy. How should nurses navigate situations where patient choices conflict with either the ethical, with the clinical recommendations or with family wishes?
Right. As an attorney, I love informed consent. It is the thing that has been the most litigated, and probably, there aren't really a lot of cases about nurses in the literature. But this is an area where if you seek nursing and informed consent, you probably will find some legal literature in this area. But I think it's important that nurses always clearly affirm that the primary decision maker is the patient. Now, I get it. Sometimes there are capacity issues and we have to deal with capacity issues and patients need to be evaluated. But every time I hear capacity, after my time as an ethics consultant and after my time in law school, what I think of is the person just choosing something you would not? Is that bias coming into play? Because so many times we say that is just crazy. So this person cannot have capacity. But in fact, they can have capacity. And our patients and even our patients as populations or communities can choose things different than we would choose. And I think it's really important always as a nurse to think about that this person is choosing something I would not, and acknowledge that right up front. They're saying, I won't take this medication, you would. They're saying, I don't want this treatment to extend my life, you would. And it's after we do that, and we acknowledge that we can actually be a more helpful ethical mediator to help the patient's words, thoughts be heard by the family, by the rest of the team, by our fellow nurses who often, are not hearing this. So we have to remember, we have to respect choices even when they're not ours. But I'll just anecdotally, I'm sorry, I kind of jump off the question, but here's an exemplar. So many patients choose dialysis. Years ago, in one of my very early studies, it was determined that the majority, and I'm talking about well over 50, 60% of dialysis nurses would not choose dialysis.
Mhm.
So there's the opposite. These patients have all chosen it. The nurses are caring for them and they would never choose it. So I think it's important for us to really remember that we have to ensure that the external pressures are not forcing decisions on patients. Being persuasive is okay, but there is a line between persuasion and coercion.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of us as nurses think about our role, to your point, as an ethical mediator. That's a new term here that is very applicable to how this provision plays out. So if you didn't know, you add it to your list of roles per the code. We're all ethical mediators. So the ethics has sort of had to evolve, as you said, and the 2025 code acknowledges the expanding role of digital health technologies. How does Provision 1 now help to guide nurses in maintaining compassion and human connection while practicing in telehealth and AI technology supported environments?
Well, I think the answer is really simple. Technology doesn't replace nurses. So, we have to remember it's a tool.
Yes.
And it's an important tool. And we want to utilize it because it really can, if we use it correctly, give us more time with patients. But we have to be sure it doesn't interfere in our therapeutic relationship, and that, it's not dehumanizing. Digital interactions, have to be monitored.
Yes.
And you have to, really be active in those technologies, and also looking for that bias we were talking about. Here it comes again.
Yes.
It can be biasing. But the main point I want to make here is that AI and technology will not replace a nurse. But nurses who embrace and learn how to use and understand technology and apply their ethical tools to technology will replace those nurses who refuse to learn and grow. So we all have to get on board and really work towards this. And this is that, society is changing. The technology is here. It's not going away, but it's not a replacement. But I still want a robot in our college as a helping instrument. I think
Yes.
that's what I want it for, so we can demonstrate how it can free time for someone. It can go get supplies. It can do all those things that take you away from where you are. But anyway, another aside.
Well, it also talks about how, as nurses, we now have a responsibility to monitor for the bias that the technology itself could potentially introduce.
Mhm.
And serve again as that gatekeeper. So therein lies that connection.
And I'll add the digital mediator, to help interpret what is happening here.
Absolutely. Provision 1 also highlights respect for every person. So what strategies does the code encourage for ensuring equitable, compassionate care for vulnerable groups, such as migrants, incarcerated individuals, or patients experiencing homelessness?
You know, our code has advanced us, and in a way, it's taken us back.
Yeah.
And I know we'll talk about more when we get past this final sort of area of provision one. Because, you know, we're now looking at populations and we're addressing barriers wherever they might be. Nursing has always responded to vulnerable populations, but now we're being called out to act. We also have to look and be culturally aware of what's happening.
Right.
You know, we have a society that's been traumatized. So we have to deliver trauma-informed care. We have to know what's happening. And we have to build trust and do this in, you know, with a non-judgmental presence. And especially for those who can't speak for themselves, where there's systematic injustice already in place, you know, for all of those vulnerable groups that you're talking about.
Right. You know, to your point about our trauma society, COVID really made that a very salient point. About halfway through the pandemic, I stopped asking people how you're doing. And I started really asking them very intentionally, so how are you handling your trauma? Because a lot of people were like, what? It was like, oh, you don't know you've been traumatized? So we all have. So it's really interesting how this has evolved. But I think we now have a much better understanding of provision one. So I want to move us to a discussion of provision two. And I'm going to read it. And provision two states the nurse's primary commitment is to the patient, whether an individual, family, group, community, or population. So let's first talk about this expanding definition of patient, because the provision broadens the concept beyond just individuals. What changes in the 2025 code update helps nurses better understand their ethical commitments when the patient includes not only individuals, but also communities and larger populations?
And I think bringing up COVID,
Yes.
you know, just prior to this, really, that's sort of, I think, what led us really to expanding the definition of patient as well as adding the global piece at the end, you know, because those things, you know, in 2020 and beyond really became more clear. It was always implied in the prior, you know, codes of ethics that I worked on, that the nurse had a commitment that was broader than the patient. Most people already recognize that the patient is extended to family and much of that extends to community. But COVID really made us look at population. And I think that changed our commitment to go beyond the bedside. But what it also did was bring us back to public health.
Yes.
Our roots, you know, Florence's early days, you know, of taking nursing to the community, to the population versus the population. We return to much of that. And now we talk about recipients of nursing care.
Right.
So it could be the individual, it could be a much more large population. And I think those population health principles are back. The majority of nursing is really grateful for that. And it certainly also drives us now to look at the collective patient outcomes, because that changes our practice.
Right.
That changes system level care. In fact, during COVID, it changed care across the world. So, you know, I think it's really important that we recognize that this is strengthening us and it's protecting community wellness and, you know, community based participatory approaches.
Okay. So in terms of then, how does one balance that individual perspective in the needs of the population So how does the code then guide nurses when the needs of a population, such as during the public health crisis, like the pandemic, may conflict with the immediate needs or wishes of individual patients? You know, there was a lot of individualistic behavior during the pandemic that wasn't necessarily in support of or at times was in conflict with what we needed to do as a population. There was a lot going on.
Right. Well, a crisis like COVID, and there are lots of other crises that happen, many of them associated with climate change.
Right.
The snowstorm we just had,
Yes.
those public health type emergencies, most of that isn't really coming from this provision. It's really, if you're really seeking input, you'll find some of it here, but most of it you're gonna find in provision 8. So if you go through it really talks about, you know, assuring that individual patients aren't lost, you know, when you have, you know, a big disruption. So, for example, I think if we track back to the floods that happened in New Orleans, that was where, you know, we really saw some of this come to fruition, and many of you who are older will remember the lawsuits against nurses and physicians, because they became sort of the economic stewards of what was available. And, you know, it was important to be sure that, you know, we weren't choosing to lose a patient or to drop the vulnerable populations as we do our sort of resource management during those types of things. All our rationale has to be transparent to the world. We have to be able to share our decision-making, which for those of you who are interested and weren't around during Katrina, you can go back and there's much written on how those decisions were made. And, you know, thankfully, there were good doctors and good nurses who were able to, who had discussions and did not do this on a whim and did not, you know, attempt to be unfair in their allocation. And they attempted to ensure that the vulnerable populations were covered. But within this provision, I think those conflicts of interest that relate to the nurse herself. Does she have a financial stake in what's happening with this patient? For example, you know, her husband works for the company whose treatment or equipment is needed here. You know, is she identifying her own?
She or he.
Thank you, Sheldon. They, the nurses.
The nurses.
The nurses, you know, have involved. I mean, and this goes down to, you know, even like political discussion, you know, what you're researching, you know, how are you financially in this? And it also talks about an area that we don't often talk about, but is in this provision, and I just want to highlight it. Those who work in situations like the military, like corrections, where they're in a position where they might find that the authority over them is in conflict with their nursing values and the code of ethics. And I just want to share one other aside that I did go and earn myself a coin talking about that the code of ethics was primary for military nurses at Guantanamo Bay at the time that patients were asking not to be fed. And we had huge discussions at the highest level of the federal government and the military about where does the code of ethics fall. But again, there are a lot of individual situations where maybe I wouldn't be making that same statement about military and conflict. But, you know, that was one where I did try to toe the line that a nurse had to use her code as she worked with them as individual patients, not as prisoners. But prisoners do, and I don't think they were called prisoners. They were detainees. Thank you. You know, where you have detainees and prisoners, it's a different line. And those conflicts are also situated in this area of the code. Important for those who are in those areas.
Absolutely. That brings us to a discussion that's also in this provision about nurse-patient boundaries. So, because provision 2 addresses how maintaining professional boundaries. However, maintaining those professional boundaries between a nurse and a patient or family can be difficult when a nurse invests so much time and energy in providing care. What strategies does the updated code offer to help nurses define and maintain ethical boundaries in an era of social media, digital communication, and increased patient access?
I love this portion of the code because it's the one that I seem to get the most questions about all the time.
Yes.
Because it's kind of broad. You know, crossing boundaries can mean so many things. But I think it's all about making sure you understand what are the clear, consistent boundaries. And I'm going to give a plug to ANA. They have done a terrific module on this. I realize there's a cost associated with, but I encourage everyone, whoever has questions about boundaries, to do that module because it does everything from talk about boundaries, getting an expensive gift from someone.
Right.
A patient who wants to date you, and maybe you want to date them. I mean, so I encourage people that there are now scenarios to help you think through this. And there's never one answer, Sheldon.
No.
I mean, it's not like, can't do that. So, you know, these things always have to be thought through. This is where we have to talk to others.
Yes.
Get advice. Don't try to resolve these things on your own. Obviously, I want everyone to go and look in the code in this particular section on boundaries. But then if it's still not clear, let's think it through. You know, let's really emphasize that the responsibility could go beyond an individual person. And that as a group, as a collective, as healthcare organizations, we all have responsibility. Most of your healthcare organizations are going to have some clear policies to really help you. Boom. Yeah, there's your policy, tells you what this healthcare system allows. But in many instances, there aren't policies. And so we really need to be mindful that it's important.
Well, this became even more salient recently with the nurses that were fired for doing postings at work. And we know most of us who work in academia, we have policies around posting and using cameras for our students in the clinical setting. Those are those boundaries that we're talking about that this provision, I think, attempts to help us.
Yeah, and it's a digital era, so it's really easy. Our phone is in our pocket.
All the time, all the time. The provision also emphasizes advocacy as a core responsibility. So what does effective advocacy look like in 2025, especially for nurses working in systems that are strained by staffing shortages, organizational constraints, and conflicts of interest? And to be a very real context, we have nurses striking all over the country at the moment, unprecedented. Particularly the nurse strike in New York and the one in California.
So effective advocacy by nurses is more than just advocating for a patient. So, you know, obviously direct patient advocacy is easier.
Yes.
So, but, you know, systems are challenging. And so we have to also make sure that there is not unsafe staffing, that there are equitable, not inequitable policies where we are. And I think in these strained environments, I'm going to go back to something I said a little while. Nurses must find their voice.
Yes.
They must speak up. They must bring these inequities to the attention of those who can manage them. So staffing cannot usually be managed by nurses, although in those places where they have let staffing be managed by nurses, I don't think they have as many problems, Sheldon. But you know, when there's unsafe conditions, nurses have to speak up.
Yes.
Sometimes nurses have to leave,
Yes.
you know, and sometimes nurses have to form unions and strike because there have to be channels by which we can assure that we can carry out the care of patients. So I think that's really important. And, you know, the code definitely emphasizes that it's not just nursing, that it's interprofessional, that some issues around safety and staffing extend to others. And so we really need to talk with our colleagues as well.
Be collaborative.
Right.
Be collaborative.
And we have a whole provision on collaboration now, but I won't be here for that one, I don't
Yes.
think, but
No.
it's coming. There's a whole provision on collaboration.
So the last question I'll ask, specific to this provision, talks about how nurses can participate in broader efforts such as health policy reform, community outreach, public health initiatives, while still centering the needs of all patients. This is that commitment to collective well-being.
Mhm.
So what are your thoughts there?
Well, as I look at how we've changed in provision 2 to defining not only a patient as the person who's right in front of you, but the patient as a population or as a collective.
Yeah.
It brings us more to mind of sort of public health promotion and things of that nature that nurses are now engaging in. And I want to say that we now have something that we'll call ethical consistency.
Yes.
So the code is pushing us in a direction where we have to think about ethical consistency, and that the ethics that we use at the bedside with one patient is the same ethics that we use when we're dealing with a larger group or population. It's not different, it's the same. So, I really encourage
Yeah,
us
principle doesn't change.
to know that, the new code confirms individuals and populations are on the same ethical plane. So that's a different concept we're not used to really thinking about,
Yes.
but it's something that we're really, I think, turning back to, Sheldon, if you
Yes.
look historically at public health.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So the macro and the micro are now being made equivalent.
You made equivalents. Well, thank you. So in the spirit of time, because we have about 7 minutes, so we have 7 minutes to do our closing questions. So how does then provision 1 and provision 2, as we've now talked about it, work together to shape the ethical identity of the nursing profession?
So I'm gonna push us a little further, because when you put up your original slide, we have those nurse to patient commitments, and it actually includes provision 1, provision 2, and provision 3.
3.
So taken together, they are our primary commitments, and they drive compassion, dignity, respect. They drive that home. And so I think that we need to remember that these are foundational. Remember, there's 1, and then there's 2, and then there's 3, and then that's a collective about nursing commitments to the patients or those nursing serves, whoever that might be.
Right. All right.
It's a unified model.
Got it. Got it. So we're also into preparing future nurses. That's what we do all across in universities and colleges. So what advice then would you offer to those nursing students, the new graduate out there, on how do they embrace these provisions as they now enter practice in our rapidly changing healthcare landscape?
So I think there are 5 things I would like to encourage all those who are studying and will enter the profession to look at. The first is to look at the code.
Read the code.
To read the code.
Yeah.
And when you read it, you can read it quickly a couple times, but remember, if you can get some of this in your head, you'll know to go back to it.
Yes.
It's a guide. It's not to be memorized.
Right.
It's to be applied.
Right.
It's real time.
Right.
So that's 1. And, when they're in practice, which is coming very soon, or even here, because the code does apply to student nurses as well.
Yes.
They are held to the same standard as everyone who's practicing nursing, is that when they see things in practice that confuse them, that they feel are wrong, that they just think they need guidance on, to go and search for it in here, to try to figure out where does it fit? Is it in the first three provisions? Is it in the next three that talk about the nurse? Is it in the last four that are society? Where is it? But do remember that these provisions build and overlap. So, you know, I kind of jumped to some other provisions and answering questions, but, you know, I do think they do fit together. So use it in practice. Find your voice. You've got to find your voice. It's very hard. And I get it. Some people are shy. You feel like maybe you're less competent than someone else, but you have to find your voice and be willing to be wrong, to question. You may get a perfectly good response back and it might make really good sense to you, or you might get a horrible response. And then that's when I go to the next thing. You need a mentor. Everyone needs a mentor. Even I need a mentor. We all have to have people that we turn to when we feel like we need a good nurse leader to help us to find our way.
Right.
And then I would say fifth, if all else fails, never stay in a position where your values are compromised.
Yes.
If as a nurse, you are being morally compromised, you cannot practice ethically. Find another position. There has to be something else, because the risk there is sort of the caveat. It's not one of the five.
Right.
But if you lose your license because you're practicing unethically, well, you've lost a lot more than a position. So you really, if you can't change things, then you must, in my mind, find something else where your ethics are not compromised.
Yeah.
And then I'll add to that to remember that the code will be used to support your practice, but it will also be used against you if you do not act according to the standard of practice. Remember, it's the number one standard for nursing, and we sort of talked about that at the beginning.
I think it's also how we hold each other accountable, and we hold the whole profession accountable. But you made an interesting point that I really want to make sure we emphasize as we bring the program to a close, and how this is a living document and things change over time.
Mhm.
In that something might happen in a clinical setting that the code doesn't address, because
It's new.
everything's evolving. So I want to give you an opportunity to have a final reflection. And is there a message that you want the folks that are tuned in today to take away from the 2025 code regarding those areas of compassion, patient commitment, and ethical practice?
I think those three areas are key to who we are and key to what we do. They're what creates trust. And we didn't really talk a lot about trust, but look at us and trust. You know, we've only been in the Gallup poll since 1999, and we only missed 1 year as the most trusted professional. Before us, pharmacists were on the list, but we weren't, and they were the most trusted health professional. Rarely has it been medicine or other people, and never, to my knowledge, has it really been police and firefighters, except during 2001, and they well deserved to have that recognition, and nursing was happy to yield it to them. But again, you know, these principles are what helps us to confront bias, to advance equity, to care for vulnerable populations, to advocate, you know, and much of that will come out in provision 3 when you talk about it. So, I mean, I think as a collective, we are more powerful than as an individual nurse. Obviously, the care that a nurse provides each and every day to a singular patient or to their family is vital. And that's where we get that compassion, care, and trust. But collectively, we have to look beyond that. We have to be more. Discussion about that will come further as we have these series. But I think this is the primacy. We start with those principles and we're rooted in it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. We are right at time, but owing to our audience, I want to give an opportunity for first, is there any question from anyone in our audience in person here for Dean Batson? All right, do we have a question online?
Dr. Field, we do. I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead.
We have Jacqueline Miller, who had the first question. She asked, "Is compassion innate or a learned trait? Can nurse educators teach compassion?"
I think nurse educators can foster. And I think that the majority of those who come to nursing, if you ask them why they're here, it's because they want to help others. So the majority of nurses already have that sense of compassion, and they just need to find a way to, be enabled to utilize it. So I think it is some innate, because I haven't met anyone yet who didn't say they wanted to be a nurse to help others. No one has ever said, I didn't pick that as a reason to become a nurse. I think there may be a few who aspire to other things, and that nursing is a means to do that. But I think we do teach it. I think in simulation, we assess it.
Right.
So do they have to already be hitting the nail on the head when they walk through the door? No. And I think that what we do encourages us. So I'm trying to think, I know there was a simulation example and it just popped out of my head, but I do think in simulation we can see. Oh, I'll give you an example now I can think of it. So when we were here opening the building, and students were, demonstrating with, our sim man, I think it was that day. A student noticed that the covers had slipped down on the simulator and covered the simulator.
Yes.
This is compassionate care.
Absolutely. 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 Ms. Holliday, is there one other question?
Yes. Danielle Sarek had the second question. She says, "What are your recommendations for nurses who practice in facilities in states that suppress and do not allow issues related to racism, bias, diversity, etc., to be discussed openly?"
Yeah, there's a lot of that at the moment, sort of anti-DEI, anti-justice diversity.
Right. Many of our colleagues in nursing are in states where this has happened, but it hasn't stopped good nursing care. And it doesn't stop us from talking about it because our code talks about it. So we have to talk about it. How it is carried out and the words that people use, are different. And certainly, the laws are having an impact on that. But I would encourage people to think about it in the same way they would a patient who comes in a state where abortion is not allowed in that state. That doesn't release us of our obligation to share everything with that patient just because we don't offer it here. Patients cannot have informed consent if they do not know all of their options. And as nurses, we are often the person who is negotiating or providing that information. So I think diversity issues, equity, inclusion, belonging fit in the same boat.
Yes.
We can't not keep it as an option.
No. Well, on that note, I don't want us to run too far over time, so we're going to close the program for today. But I really want to first thank you all again for joining us, both in person and for those who joined us online. And please join me in thanking Dean Badzik for her time and expert insight into our nursing code of ethics. Join me in a round of applause for Dean Bagdon. I want to thank everybody in the College of Nursing here at Penn State and our staff who helped us to develop and to execute the program today. And finally, thanks again for spending your time with us this afternoon as we discuss this very important topic to the nursing profession. Please look out for the flyers and the additional information that will come out and the dates for parts 2, 3, and 4. Everybody, wherever you are, be safe. Thank you again. Bye-bye for now.